The world of Psalm 1 is orderly and clear and makes sense. In the world of Psalm 1, the righteous prosper, the wicked do not prosper. In the world of Psalm 1, those who follow God's laws, those who are righteous, those who are good, find that everything they touch turns to success. Those who do not follow God's ways, those who are wicked are blown away like chaff. That world is orderly. That world is good. That world makes perfect sense. And yet we'll hear as we talk about some other Psalms this morning, and we'll hear, if we are familiar readers of the Psalms already, that in many ways Psalm 1 stands as a counter voice to some of the other voices we hear in the Psalms. In many ways, Psalm 1 stands in contrast to the voice we'll hear later on in this collection of works. But before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about what the Psalms are. I want to introduce this book, this collection of ancient hymns. I want to try to demystify the mystery of them so that we can more clearly enter into the message that they have to offer to us. So first and foremost, the Psalms are an ancient songbook. That is first and foremost the definition of what they are. We know that there are notations in the Psalms to the leader of music. There are notations to the choir director. We know that in medieval times, when Jewish scholars who were in touch with ancient traditions went about transcribing the Psalms, they added these little notes that are called cantillation marks. And these cantillation marks were there as a way of saying, when you recite these Psalms out loud, when you chant them in worship, these are the words that you should emphasize. This is the kind of tone you bring to the reading. Now, those medieval writers didn't leave us with any sense of the music. I think because by the time they were writing, the music had already been lost. Somewhere along the lines, we lost the music that was attached to these poems. We hear in the Psalms themselves that there are specific instruments that they make reference to. There's lyres, there's trumpets, there's other specific instruments, but we don't have a set of musical notes. We don't have, any ancient recordings from 500 BC that tell us what this music sounded like. We know that it was a musical tradition. We know that they were used in worship, but we don't know a lot more than that. Now, as the Psalms have sort of moved through their time in history, they are, of course, put to music in certain traditions. There are some modern-day Christian traditions who believe that the only music that should be sung in worship should come from a psalm, and it should be the direct words of the psalm, and it should only be sung without musical accompaniment. So there are some denominations that you might find out in the world, some of them in churches that are pretty close to us, that are in our neighborhood, that would say that the only music that there ever be in worship is a psalm sung a cappella without any kind of musical accompaniment. We have in our tradition psalms that we've set to music. We sang one of them this morning. When we sang "This is the day that the Lord has made," we were singing a musical version of Psalm 118. And later on, after the sermon, we'll sing a musical version of Psalm 1. Now, in our hymnody, when we put the Psalms to music, we'll often take license to sort of move away from the plain text that you'd find in the Bible. We'll take license to sort of move away from the plain text of what you'll see in Scripture when we're setting these to music, because we want to highlight the poetry of it. We want to highlight the intensity of it. We want to highlight the profoundness of this language that so often gets lost in translation. One of our most famous psalms set to music, and don't worry, I'm not going to try to sing it for you, but I think when I say the words, some of you will know it. My shepherd will supply my need. Jehovah is his name. A beautiful psalm set to music. And it doesn't exactly mimic the words of Psalm 23, but you hear the message, you hear the tone, you hear the basic ideas of Psalm 23 coming through in that hymn that's part of our tradition. Now, in modern day Jewish traditions, they sing the Psalms as well. And they sing a version that will pay close attention to those cantillation marks from the Middle Ages, those marks that say these are the words you should emphasize. But every locality sort of figures out its own way to do the rhythm. They figure out their own way to do the melody. And so different places will sort of incorporate local traditions and combine them with those marks they find in the Middle Age text. And that sort of creates this alchemy of the ancient and the medieval and the modern that comes into their worship in modern Jewish circles. And so these Psalms, again, are an ancient songbook, a beautiful songbook that we know was used in worship in ancient times, used in worship in medieval times, used in worship for us today. And that is what they are at their core. Now, the other thing we have to say about the Psalms is that there's an intensity of language in them. I want to quote from a biblical scholar named Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann is probably the most well-known Old Testament scholar who's writing from the Christian tradition today. So he's probably the most well-known Old Testament scholar writing from the Christian tradition today. And when he talks about the Psalms, he wants to emphasize their very Jewish character. He wants to emphasize how they are profoundly a creation of the Jewish people in those Old Testament times and of their particular struggles and joys as a community and as individual people. Here's what Brueggemann says. Brueggemann says that the Psalms reflect the shape of active protesting suffering. The shape of active protesting suffering and the shape of defiant, resilient hope. Active protesting suffering and defiant, resilient hope. The stuff of Jewish suffering and Jewish hope is a unique partner to the form of strident, subversive, intense forms of language. And I want to underline that because we, of course, are Christian people who are approaching a Jewish thing. And it's something that we can't fully understand. Part of it is the translation. Since we're not reading it in Hebrew, we miss out on some of the intensity of the language. We miss out on some of the power of the metaphors and the poetry. Part of it, though, also is that we haven't had the communal experiences that they've had. We haven't gone through exile. We haven't gone through slavery. We haven't been conquered by other nations. There's a set of communal experiences that they bring to the formation of these Psalms that we just don't have. And so I'm going to return to that later, but I want to underscore it here at the beginning. Now, as we said earlier, Psalm 1 is kind of a counterweight to some of the other Psalms that we'll hear later on. Psalm 1 presents a pretty simple and clear message. It says, again, follow the laws of God. If you follow the laws of God, you'll prosper. If you do not follow the laws of God, you will not prosper. It's a simple message. It's a clear message. If the world were really like that, how wonderful that would be. Now, one of the things that's worth noting is that the Psalms, as we have them, are editions of collections that were put together throughout history. So the Psalms probably hit their finished form maybe around 400 BC or so. Before that, there were other collections of Psalms. We actually see in the Psalms that we have some of the notations that tell us that they come from previous editions that have been put together for this edition. So we see the marks of previous editing. We also see that there are far more Psalms that they could have chosen. So they pared it down to the 150 that we have in our Bible. Now, it was an intentional choice then to make Psalm 1 the first psalm. It was an intentional choice by the people who edited this, who brought it to its finished form, that what we know as Psalm 1 would be the first one. And I think what they wanted to convey to us, I don't know, maybe it could have been that they were saying, whatever the poetry of those next few Psalms say, don't let yourself get too carried away in flights of fancy. Don't let yourself get too carried away in poetry. The real stuff is the law of God. The real stuff is the commandments, the Pentateuch. Don't let yourself get too carried away by the melody and the rhythm and the verses. Or they might have been saying, hear this voice before you hear those other voices. Hear this argument before you hear those other arguments. Know that some of what you'll hear in this book doesn't reflect the full truth of who God is. And know too that Psalm 1 doesn't reflect the full truth of who God is, but we have to listen to them in conversation with each other. And so let's enter into that conversation a little bit. I'd like to read to you from Psalm 10. And I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version that we have in our pew Bibles. So if you want to follow along, we're in Psalm 10. And what I want to highlight here is we just heard in Psalm 1 that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. But that's not what Psalm 10 says. Psalm 10 says quite the opposite. And it has some feelings to share about that. So here's Psalm 10. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In arrogance, the wicked persecute the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes they have devised. For the wicked boast of the desires of their heart. Those greedy for gain curse and renounce the Lord. In the pride of their countenance, the wicked say, God will not seek it out. All their thoughts are, there is no God. Their ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of their sight. As for the foes of the wicked, they scoff at their foes. They think in their heart, we shall not be moved. Throughout all generations, we shall not meet adversity. Their mouths are filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. Under their tongues are mischief and iniquity. They sit in ambush in the villages. In hiding places, they murder the innocent. Their eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. They lurk in secret like a lion in his covert. They lurk that they may seize the poor. They seize the poor and drag them off in their net. They stoop, they crouch, and the helpless fall by their might. They think in their heart, God has forgotten. God has hidden his face. He will never see it. Rise up, O Lord, O God, lift your hand. Do not forget the oppressed. Why do the wicked renounce God and say in their hearts, you will not call us to account? But you do see. Indeed, you know trouble and grief, that you may take it into your hands. The helpless commit themselves to you. You have been the helper of the orphan. Lord, break the arm of the wicked and evildoers. Seek out their wickedness until you find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations shall perish from his hand. O Lord, you will hear the desire of the meek. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice for the orphan and the oppressed, so that those from earth may strike terror no more. In Psalm 10, there's a sense that eventually it will all work out. There's a sense that eventually God will wake up and fix this. There's a sense that eventually God will bring justice to this situation. God will punish the wicked. God will set things right. But the reality of the psalm speaker in this moment is not that. The reality of the psalm speaker in this moment is that the wicked are prospering. Everything they touch is doing well. The righteous are being kicked around. And again, that's different from what Psalm 1 tells us. And so we have to listen to the two in conversation. And I would submit to you that there's something interesting that happens when we hear them in conversation with each other. Certainly, along with the writer of Psalm 10, we can affirm that even if it seems in the moment like those who turn from God are doing well, like those who follow a righteous path are not prospering, even if it seems for the moment like that's true, that's not an eternal truth. But I think we also have to find ourselves looking back at Psalm 1 and saying, what does it really mean to prosper? What does it really mean for things to go well for us? Surely it's not that we get rich. Surely it's not that we have all the material things we could possibly ever desire. Surely it's not the external trappings of success that Psalm 1 is pointing to when it says that the righteous shall prosper in everything. So what is it pointing to? I'd like to reread Psalm 1, but I want to read it from a different translation. This comes from a book called A Book of Psalms, selected and adapted from the Hebrew by an author named Stephen Mitchell. And Mitchell doesn't set out to rewrite every one of the Psalms, but there are certain Psalms that speak to his poetic heart, and he strives to offer some new words for them, with the idea that there are times when we sort of miss the intensity or we miss the meaning of the words in translation. So he strives to write in a modern poetic tone that better conveys the feeling of the Psalms, even if the words are a little bit different. And so the book is A Book of Psalms, selected and adapted from the Hebrew by Stephen Mitchell. And this is the way he writes Psalm 1. He says, "Blessed are the man and woman who have grown beyond their greed and have put an end to their hatred and no longer nourish illusions. Blessed are the man and woman who have grown beyond their greed and have put an end to their hatred and no longer nourish illusions, but they delight in the way things are, and they keep their hearts open day and night. They are like trees planted near flowing rivers, which bear fruit when they are ready. Their leaves will not fall or wither. Everything they do will succeed." Two of the most striking lines for me in Mitchell's version of the psalm: "They delight in the way things are and keep their hearts open day and night." Now, those words are extrapolations. Those words aren't clearly articulated in Psalm 1, either in the Hebrew text or in translation. But I think he gets the idea right, because we can't possibly read Psalm 1 without knowing that there are other Psalms that say something different. We can't possibly read Psalm 1 without knowing that we have to reconfigure our ideas of what prosperity is. And Mitchell proposes a good idea here. The people who delight in the ways of the Lord delight in the way things are. They show gratitude. They are people who see the world around them and they appreciate it. They're people who see the people around them, and they appreciate those people. People who look at the situation in which they find themselves, and even if they find themselves struggling, even if they find themselves moving through hardship, they see the things that they can lift up and be grateful for and appreciate. They delight in the way things are. Gratitude, the inculcation of gratitude, is one of the ways that following the laws of the Lord leads us to prosperity. Another, according to Mitchell, is they keep their hearts open day and night. And so they find themselves in situations where they're curious, where they're interested, where they haven't necessarily prejudged other people or other situations, where they are open. Their minds and hearts are open. And I would propose that those two things, that gratitude for the way things are, that sense of always being able to look for what to appreciate, and that openness to who people will be, to what the situation is, to how God might work in it, that those are two things that can carry us to prosperity no matter what our situation is. Those are two things that can carry us to prosperity no matter what the external circumstances are. And so when Psalm 1 says that the righteous will prosper, I don't think it means that they'll prosper by external success. I think it means that the law of God will change their hearts and help them be grateful and help them be open. And that's what true prosperity means. To illustrate the point, I find myself thinking about a young man I knew back in college, a young man who had an opportunity. His father worked for an agricultural company that many of you will know by reputation. His father worked for Monsanto. And I mention that just because it's part of the story. I don't necessarily mean to make it part of the message here. But this friend of mine in college, his father worked for Monsanto. And he had the opportunity one summer to intern with his dad's company, and in particular to go to the Philippines. When he came back from the Philippines that fall, he wrote about the transformation that had happened to him while he was there. He wrote that he had gone into the experience thinking, I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you modernize your agricultural practices. I'm here to help you figure out what you need to get higher yields in your crops. I'm here to help the people who are here. What he found, though, was that as he encountered people who lived in poor villages, who lived in houses that didn't have any kind of flooring except for the dirt on the ground, as he encountered people who lived in what anyone might class as poverty, he found that those people were a lot happier than a lot of the people he knew back home, and a lot happier than he himself was. And I think that gets to the point of what Psalm 1 is all about. That when God promises us prosperity, God promises us an outlook on life. God promises us gratitude. God promises us hopefulness and openness if we submit to the law of the Lord and are shaped by it. And those things will inform how we approach any situation. No matter what the circumstances are, they may be developing world poverty. But nonetheless, if we are shaped by the law of God, if we are shaped by a particular outlook on life, we find that everything we do prospers. We find that we are like trees planted by streams of water, continually nourished by the river of life going before us. In great circumstances, in lowly circumstances, we praise God. And that is how we find ourselves in the path that God would have us follow. Amen.